Yakuza 3 is easily the most divisive of the mainline Yakuza games, and on the surface, it's not hard to see why. Out of any game in the series, it's inarguably aged the worst in a lot of aspects. But just because something is a little dated, I don't think that necessarily means it's bad. A year ago, I went out of my way to play the PS2 Yakuza games, and they were significantly better than I thought they'd be, and have held up extremely well in my opinion. My new perspective on these games made me curious if 3 held up in a similar way. The last time I had played Yakuza 3 was in 2017, and I had a decent time with it, but I definitely felt its age more than the other PS3 Yakuza games. My feelings on the game were always pretty neutral, however the more and more I got into the Yakuza fandom, the more I really wondered why fans were so split on this game. I'd seen plenty of people say this was one of the best Yakuza games, and even more that said it was one of the worst. So I decided to go back and see if there's anything more to this game that I might not have gotten out of my first playthrough. Before we begin, I'll be pretty much going into every aspect of Yakuza 3, so expect heavy spoilers. So probably the thing that makes 3 so divisive among fans is the combat. And I'll admit, coming back to the game after years of playing much more in-depth combat systems, 3 definitely took a while to adjust to, particularly for one reason. Yakuza 3 has become pretty infamous for just how much enemies block your attacks. Most enemies will guard in some way, making landing basic combos quite difficult at times. This is especially the case with bosses who very rarely will give you an opportunity to hit them with a basic string. This is compounded by another major issue 3 has. In most Yakuza games, it's pretty easy to use your dash to quickly get behind enemies, allowing for uninterrupted combos. However, pretty consistently, Kiryu will end up dashing so far that he ends up right back in front of the enemy. Now that's not to say this happens all the time, but it happens enough to where I couldn't really call this a reliable tactic in most fights. One strategy I found that helped me a little bit is to not even bother using the strafe button, and instead to just run behind the enemy to get a punish. Early on in the game, it's pretty tough to find any answer to the iron walls that enemies can be, which can prove to be pretty frustrating. But there are a few workarounds to this issue. Firstly, you can obviously just grab most enemies, although this often doesn't work against bosses. One thing I found is that enemies often won't block directional attacks, so you can use those if you're struggling. Probably the most efficient strategy I found early on involves the sidestep strike. Yakuza 3 has some weird properties involving walls. If you throw an enemy against a wall and quickly use the sidestep strike, you'll be able to rack up some damage and build heat pretty quickly. You can land some pretty nasty combos with it if you know what you're doing. I don't really, so I mostly just use the basics, but even those prove to be pretty effective. Be warned though, enemies can also do some pretty nasty corner juggles to you as well. I had a lot of different moments where enemies and bosses racked up pretty absurd amounts of damage on me via these weird juggle states. You can also use the kick with triangle to extend combos, although I wasn't very good at it, so here's some footage of someone who actually knows what they're doing.
Once again, no damaging all the boss fights in a Yakuza game. This time, instead of Yakuza 2, we are doing Yakuza 3. And starting off, we are fighting Goro Majima. So here, we're kind of...
You can also use this grab to immediately stand enemies back up and get free hits on them. Just be sure to grab them by the head when you do so. Overall, your options are pretty limited at first, but once you get to Komarocho, you're able to access the Dragon Palace by completing a quick sub-story. Once there, you're able to talk to Komaki, who tasks you with defeating 3 of his students. They aren't too difficult to take down, although getting Tiger dropped by the second one did kind of put the fear of God into me for a little bit, but they're still pretty easy to defeat. Beating them will reward you with various Komaki techniques, although you only really need 2, the Tiger Drop and the Komaki Parry. Getting both of these skills I'd say is essential, especially the parry, since it's one of the best ways to reliably hit enemies from behind for a clean combo. There's a lot of other techniques to extend damage and open up enemies, so don't consider anything I've said like the definitive guide on how to play Yakuza 3, more so just my general approach to the game. The game also puts a pretty heavy emphasis on weapon creation and upgrading, which I didn't really mess around with too much. But I can definitely see the value in it. The enemies give you materials for it pretty frequently, so it's definitely worth making some if you're having trouble. Weapons and various background elements can help a lot with damage. I was playing on hard mode, and Kiryu does very little damage to bosses, which often made fights kinda drag on. although I'm not sure if this is as big of an issue on other difficulties. While I do find fights long, I will say 3 has some really fantastic boss battles, including the fight against Joji Kazuma. I love that Joji actually does heat actions on you if you're down. I wish more Yakuza bosses did that. But easily, the game's best fight, and still one of the best bosses in the series, is the final fight against Mine, which not only created the long-running and iconic dynamic intro the series is known for, but is still probably one of the best designed fights in the series, with Mine having a wide range of attacks and even different heat forms, each with their own unique movesets you can use. I also ended up fighting Amon, and he's definitely one of the Amon fights of all time. He has 3 different phases, and the first one with these weird little lightsaber things was my least favorite by far. It just felt really annoying to fight, like I was trying to get behind him and stuff, but I just kept getting clipped by the lightsabers. The rest of the phases are honestly pretty easy and tame in comparison. In my opinion, not really worth going after, but I'm glad I did it regardless. I will say though, one thing that got pretty grating about bosses is the repeated QTEs. Now this is also an issue in the PS2 Yakuza games, however I feel like 3 in particular is a bit overkill with it. Like seriously, I ended up doing this same QTE against Anderson 3 times during the fight. Still, I'd say the bosses are a major highlight of 3's gameplay overall. Except for Kanata, fuck that fight's awful. While 3 isn't exactly my favorite in terms of combat, I still wouldn't say it's bad necessarily, just a tad archaic feeling at times. It does actually feel pretty similar to the PS2 Yakuza games, although I'd still say those games aren't quite as janky as this. Like seriously, look at the way some of these enemies wave dash across the screen while Kiryu just kinda stares at them until they do something. I have no clue why the enemies in this game move the way they do, but it's honestly something to behold. Especially characters like Mine and Majima. I know people really want a Yakuza character in Tekken, but honestly, if this was how they were moving around the screen, I think I'd just turn the game off. Now is probably a good time to bring this up, and it's kind of why most characters move like this. The way most people play 3 nowadays is via the remastered version. In addition to greatly upping the game's fidelity, the frame rate was also increased to 60 FPS, which broke several key aspects of the game. The bizarre dashing and enemies blocking too much are often attributed as problems caused by the frame rate shift. However, the issues actually extend even beyond the game's combat, as pretty much every minigame wasn't properly recalibrated for modern control sticks, making precise movements and stuff like pool and darts a frustrating endeavor. If you're playing on PC, there are several fixes for a lot of the issues I've mentioned, so I'll link a few in the description if you're interested in trying them out. However, if you're playing on console, most of these issues you're just gonna have to deal with. It's really unfortunate that RGG Studios never went out of their way to fix any of these issues. On a more positive note, one of the coolest gameplay additions comes during the Premium Adventure. I actually thought this was the first Yakuza game to have it, but the Japanese exclusive Kenzen also had a mode similar to Premium Adventure. In the PS2 games, you had to do everything in one go as they had no Premium Adventure, so if you missed any sub-stories, you had no way of getting them again, and had to replay the whole game just to get them, so 3 being the first mainline game to implement this feature is notable. Something wholly unique to this game's Premium Adventure is the All-Star Tournaments. In these, you'll face off against every boss in the main story, as well as Hamazaki, who isn't an actual boss during the game's story. He mainly just uses a generic Coliseum fighter moveset, but it's still cool that he's here regardless. There's also a tag team version of the tournament where you pair up with Majima, which is a lot of fun and extremely chaotic. I'm honestly surprised more Yakuza games don't have stuff like this. I'd love to see something similar to this come back. Outside of battle, you'll mostly be spending your time wandering between the 2 cities in this game, Komorocho and downtown Ryukyu. Komorocho is mostly what you'd expect. However, Yakuza 3 is kinda special as it was the first game in the series without a fixed camera angle, allowing you to freely explore the streets of Komorocho seamlessly. Although for me, the star of Yakuza 3 is definitely Okinawa, and more specifically downtown Ryukyu. While it's pretty small compared to most Yakuza cities, I find it an extremely charming little town. There's not a ton to do here, but just the general vibe of it I've always enjoyed. I especially love the little fish market where you can use these giant tuna and fish heads as weapons. Love just how messy the fights here get. Downtown Ryukyu was inspired by the real-life city of Naha in Okinawa. Honestly, a really nice looking rural town I'd love to visit one day if I ever got the chance. You'll also frequently be returning to Morning Glory. And I gotta say, I like having an actual home to return to instead of just Serena or some other hideout. The beautiful beach out front helps too. Something fun I learned is that the dog you adopt early on will actually follow you around after completing some sub-stories involving him. It's a cute little detail. Probably my favorite thing about Okinawa, though, is the outfit that Kiryu wears. I don't know why, but this stupid tropical shirt has always been one of my favorite designs for him. If Kiryu ever got into Smash Bros, I am demanding that this be one of his alts. Most of what you'll be doing in these cities are the classic sub-stories. There are just under 120 of them in the game. The number might seem daunting at first, but you'll quickly realize that most of these are pretty minimal quests. Most of the basic ones can be cleared in 2 minutes or even less. There are plenty of things I do enjoy about this game's sub-stories, though. A bunch of them link into one another and involve traveling between both cities. There's a few sub-stories involving members of the Ryoto family, which I appreciate. It helps you feel more connected to the family. I especially enjoyed Rikiya's sub-stories because they really help to give you a better idea of his character and make his eventual passing all the more tragic. Michu's sub-story involving his dad was also pretty interesting. I was kinda disappointed that Nakahara didn't have any quest directly involving him. I would have liked to know a little more about him and Saki, so I'm kinda surprised they didn't take the opportunity to expand on them. Another sub-story I enjoyed was the murder at Cafe Alps. Easily one of the most involved and lengthy sub-stories in the game, you're tasked with investigating a murder by talking to various witnesses, which all culminates in this Ace Attorney section, where you need to present the correct witness testimonies and evidence in order to corner the real culprit. I won't reveal any more than that. If you plan on playing this game after this video, I'd highly recommend this quest. Easily one of the highlights of the game for me. Notably, there were a few sub-stories removed from 3's remaster. These quests involved Kiryu getting chased by a character named Michiru, I don't know how to pronounce that, who was a rather tacky representation of a trans person. Even at the time, I would say that these quests were in rather poor taste. The developers even went out of their way to apologize for these, and I can understand why. They really have just aged like milk. It's honestly even more perplexing as to why this was in the game, as there's actually a pretty nice sub-story later on involving another transgender character who is treated by Kiryu with a lot more respect. It's a cute little sub-story and goes to show how accepting and kind Kiryu is to people. Pretty much nothing of value was lost with these sub-stories, unless you're one of those weirdos who's upset about your games getting too woke now. I mean, really, all you lose at the end of the day is more shitty chases, which is probably a good time to talk about these. Chases are a new mechanic added to 3, and I'm not gonna mince words. The chases are god-awful. There's very few times you'll have to do these for the main story, but a lot of sub-stories will have you doing chases, and they get extremely monotonous very quickly. They're just not fun. There's really no other way to put it. There's no real, skill or challenge. You just kind of have to run around an obstacle course really awkwardly and slam into people. Later on in the game, you can actually train Kiryu to get more stamina for these chases, which to me just goes to show how much of a major mechanic they really felt this was. The other major side activity in the game are the Hitman missions. In these, Kiryu is tasked with subduing various hitmen and helping them transition into normal society, which mostly just involves you fighting them. There's a lot of them scattered throughout both Kamurocho and Okinawa. They're mostly just copy and paste of various boss and enemy movesets, typically involving weapons. Most of the fights aren't too terribly interesting. However, the final mission has you fight against Arase, a boss from the original Yakuza. It's a nice little callback, although the fight is pitifully easy. The Hitman missions don't offer much, but they do give an absurd amount of yen for beating them, so they're worth going after if you're in need of funds. Outside of those, you'll find a standard list of Yakuza minigames like pool, darts, and gambling. One of 3's biggest new additions is a full real golf course, and I absolutely despise it. It's kinda hard to explain why I hate it so much. Everything about it just feels wrong, especially the putting. Oh my god, it is impossible to putt anything in this game. Seriously, I never want to touch it again. One interesting thing can be found in the arcade, an original game known as Boxeclios. An arcade shoot-em-up, although it's extremely bare bones, with the only objective being to shoot the enemies with this giant laser. As far as I'm aware, they don't even fight back, so it's basically just a time attack to see how far you can get. It's not much, but the fact that there's an original arcade game here is still pretty cool to me. Boxeclios would end up getting a sequel in Yakuza 4 that's a little more in-depth. Yakuza 3 also had another arcade game originally. Answer X Answer is a quiz game that can only be played in the Japanese version. You can actually still see the cabinets for them in the arcades, but there's no way to play them. Kinda wish they went out of their way to translate this game. It'd be a nice way to preserve this game, as aside from this one appearance, the game is basically lost to my knowledge. I dig the art style too. If you know anything more about this game, let me know in the comments. One of the things I feel has aged the worst about Yakuza 3 is definitely the graphics, and unfortunately the remaster made this even worse somehow. I'll say this, I don't think most of the main cast looks too bad, with the exception probably being the children. I think more so the thing that ages 3 so much more than 4 is the game's pretty horrific texture quality, that's only made way worse by upping the game's resolution. You can really see it in a lot of characters' clothing. Easily the worst offender is Majima and his horrific looking jacket. Yakuza 3 also has some pretty weird animation for characters' walk cycles. Like seriously, almost every character's basic walking animation is fucking hilarious. Kiryu is pretty well known in this game for his Chad walk, and it's fantastic. And I especially love Majima's virgin walk to go with it. But for me, the children take the cake for best walking animation. I absolutely live for this little strut some of the characters do in this game. I love just watching crowds move in this game. They're so robotic and strange, it's almost hypnotic in a way. Actually, on that topic, I noticed Yakuza 3 has a lot more densely populated city streets than normal. I ended up bumping into people a lot more than usual in certain parts of Komarocha, which does sort of make the city feel a little livelier, although I can see why it would get kind of annoying for the player. One thing I greatly enjoyed doing was knocking over pedestrians on the street. I probably wouldn't have bothered doing this as much, but the game actually keeps track of how many people you've knocked down. So clearly it's something the developers enjoyed doing as well. I don't think 3 looks terrible overall, in fact I'd argue it's aged a lot better than other games from this era, but it's still rough around the edges. Yakuza 3's story is also probably one of the more divisive ones. Now I'm not here to go frame by frame and really analyze the story of this game. Personally, I think it's alright, nothing too special really. Typically though, to me, a Yakuza game's storyline's best aspect are its characters, and 3 definitely has a colorful cast to be sure. The Ryoto family isn't the most important family in the series, especially since it's only 3 members, but I do enjoy them and wish they came back in some way. I had a lot more appreciation for Rikiya than I did when I first played the game. His sub-stories definitely helped to flesh him out. I especially enjoyed his quest involving his tattoo. It's really nice to see the tattoo artist from Yakuza 1 again. For me though, the most memorable character in 3 is the game's main antagonist, Yoshitake Mine. From the very first scene you see him, I always felt like Mine had a pretty intimidating presence, and that continues throughout the entire game. This man cut off his sworn oath brother's head and presented it to the main protagonist like it's some kind of trophy. He also stabs a guy with a butter knife on a plane. I think he kills him somehow? All this I think definitely helps to build up the final battle with him. I really just wish he had a little more screen time. Even like an extra 10 minutes I think would have really helped to flesh out his character. The game's other antagonists aren't too interesting to me. I sort of talked about Anderson in my previous video, but he's another character I think that could have gotten more time to shine. The idea of a rogue American CIA agent is pretty cool. I wish they did more with him. Really, the most memorable thing about Anderson is the fact that he says Ruff like this.
If you're looking for Daigo, Mine's taken him up to the roof.
Hamazaki and Kanata are built up a lot during the early game story, but they end up becoming fodder pretty quickly. Hamazaki doesn't even get his own boss fight of any kind during the main story. He just kind of shows up at the end to have this weird fake-out death for Kiryu. I'm not really sure what they were going for with either of these guys. Joji Kazuma is another neat idea that they really don't do a ton with, and the dude has quite literally never been mentioned or seen a single time since this game, which is really disappointing. Seems like they really regretted killing Kazuma as quickly as they did, since he's also a major character in Yakuza 2. So in a way, I could sort of see Joji Kazuma being a replacement for the original, but he never shows up after this game, so what was the point? Overall, I think 3's biggest issue when it comes to story is just how short and unimportant it ends up feeling by the end of it. The game's easily the shortest of the mainline Yakuza games, which also doesn't help this. I think it also isn't helped that Kiryu doesn't really mention anything that ever happens in this game ever again, aside from Hamazaki's appearance in Yakuza 4. I think the death of Rikiya would have had a lot more impact if it was something Kiryu routinely brought up, but I don't think he ever does. Still, I wouldn't say 3's story is the worst by any means. I'd still give that trophy to Yakuza 4. One thing I think everyone can agree on is 3 has some great music. Everyone knows about Fly, the game's final boss theme, but another I really love is the theme for Joji Kazuma's fight. It definitely helps make the fight feel more personal and emotional. And listen, I know I shit on the chases, but I do enjoy the music that plays during these a lot too. Another one of my favorites is this super bizarre song that occasionally plays during some sub-story battles. I don't know why this song plays as much as it does, but every time I hear it, I lose my shit. I wouldn't say 3 has my favorite soundtrack in the series, but there's definitely a lot of underrated tracks here. That's pretty much all I have to say about my general feelings on Yakuza 3, but before I get into my final thoughts on the game, let's go over some fun little tidbits about 3. I already covered the cut Answer X Answer arcade game in Michu, but the English release of Yakuza 3 is infamous for removing even more content. It's also infamous for having what is quite possibly one of the worst pieces of video game box art of all time. Like seriously, what underpaid intern made this and thought this was okay? Like listen, I'm sure you're the nicest guy on the planet, but what in the blue fuck were you actually thinking when you looked at the Japanese box art and thought you needed to change literally anything? The German version might be even funnier though, as it's literally just the other half of his face. Like this is some absurdly comedic shit. I have to believe the person who made this was having a laugh. So aside from the incredible box art, the initial English version cut several of the more Japanese-centric minigames, such as Mahjong and Sogi. In addition, the game's Hostess Clubs and Hostess Maker minigames were completely removed. You can still find some of the hostesses around town, so they're still there, you just can't actually do the Hostess Club minigame anymore. On the topic of hostesses, some of them were actually changed for remaster and replaced by ones from the Kiwami games. Another weird detail is that some of the hostesses from 3 actually appeared in the Japanese-exclusive PSP Yakuza game Kiryu. The initial English release of 3 also had some translation differences, with the primary ones being Morning Glory's name being changed to Sunflower Orphanage, and both Shintaro and Joji Kazuma both having their last name changed to Fuma, likely in an attempt to not have the players confuse them with Kazuma. Majima also originally called Kiryu Kazi, which I always thought was confusing because you can literally just hear him say Kiryu-chan, so I'm not really sure what the point of changing this was. Early on in the game, Mikio gives Rikiya the nickname Fighting Viper. This is a homage to the Sega AM2 game also known as Fighting Vipers. This little reference sort of came full circle as Fighting Vipers 2 would end up being playable in Like a Dragon Gaiden. Did you know that Mine is a fan of Gatorade? Well, now you do. All references to Gatorade were changed in the remastered versions. I believe he used to be able to buy Gatorade products at various stores. You can still buy Pepsi Max though. So this is kind of a weird detail more than anything, but I feel like I needed to talk about this. After completing certain objectives like finishing every sub-story or doing every hostess, you'll get a bizarre message from Sayama congratulating you, which is kind of insane to me. Yakuza 3 completely wrote her out of the series, with the excuse that she's going to America. So to have her chime in randomly here came as a surprise to me. I had never heard any other person mention this before, but there's just something so funny about Sayama congratulating Kiryu for getting laid 10 times in a row. Yakuza 3's development is pretty interesting as well. The game was made in only 8 months with a 3-week planning period. Honestly, that alone explains a lot about 3, but it is pretty impressive what they were able to accomplish in that 8-month time frame. One thing the dev team seemed especially proud of was how many unique character models they made. According to them, it was about 360, which definitely explains why Komarocho is so much denser now. Lastly, Yakuza 3's intro is slightly different in Japan, using a licensed song called Loser, sung by Eikichi Yazawa. It's a cool song and fits the vibe of Yakuza 3 pretty well. I recommend giving it a listen if you haven't before. Overall, while I still wouldn't say 3 is one of my personal favorites in the series, I can definitely see why it's garnered a following in recent years. 3 is pretty important to the series for a lot of reasons. The introduction of dynamic intros, karaoke, revelations, and premium adventure definitely helped set standards that the series would follow going forward. Recently, there's been a lot of discussion of a potential Kiwami 3, and literally a day before I finished the script, they basically went out of their way to say that while it's not being worked on right now, it will happen eventually. Whatever comes from Kiwami 3, I hope people won't stop talking about the original, as I still think there's a lot to enjoy about it. I could easily see Kiwami 3 being the definitive way to play Yakuza 3, but we'll have to see once that eventually comes to fruition. Hopefully this video gave a new perspective on Yakuza 3. There's definitely no shortage of videos on 3, but I thought I'd just give my 2 cents on it. However, after finally wrapping the game up, there was still one major question that lingered in my mind. So Mine was gay, right? Mine and Daigo's relationship is a pretty hotly debated topic among fans. A lot of people don't seem convinced that Mine actually had feelings for Daigo, and on the surface I could see why. While Mine does directly state that he loves Daigo, love doesn't inherently have to be romantic. However, in general, the way Mine talks about Daigo does definitely read more as a romantic bond rather than platonic. I've seen a lot of people claim that the Japanese version reads differently. However, in my research and talking to a few different people, I actually found the opposite to be true. This extremely detailed blog by Chairman of Yakuza goes into several different guidebooks for 3 and Ishin, which both seem to explicitly claim that Mine fell in love with Daigo, as well as a detailed analysis of the original dialogue, all which point towards Mine being gay. To me, I think it's pretty obvious that Mine has some sort of feelings for Daigo that go beyond loyalty. Their relationship kind of reminds me of Dio and Pucci, and if you somehow don't see anything gay there, then I'm not really sure what to tell you. Either way, I don't think Mine being gay actually changes anything. Daigo is still the only person in Mine's life that he's ever felt any sort of bond with whatsoever. So whether or not you want to view that as romantic is really up to you, and I kind of think that's on purpose. I think it's kind of just weird to me how many people I've seen completely deny this idea. I'll leave a link down below to the blog post I mentioned earlier if you want a proper deep dive into this topic. Overall, I think it's pretty clear RGG Studios regrets killing Mine. Maybe one day he'll finally return somehow, but considering he was featured prominently at the Like a Dragon funeral service, I doubt it's happening. Despite only having about 50 minutes of active screen time and only one game to his name, Mine stands out as one of the series' most memorable antagonists. Maybe Kiwami 3 will finally be our chance to learn more about Mine, but for now, fly high Mine. We'll probably be seeing you again soon.
まだ終わってねえ。
ミネ色っぽいですよね。
ミネがね、もう別格の色っぽさ。
ね。